Dr. Daniel Harrison, I met in 2016 when I got to Lander University. I was introduced to the College of Business, my host portion of the university. And whether Dan knows this or not, he was the first person to be nice to me at Lander University. He was literally the very first one. His office was close to mine. And he kind of, he looked over my shoulder and make sure I wasn't an idiot, which I very much appreciate. It's a small world because it wasn't 2 or 3 years later, I was on Amelia Island with my family on a vacation, and I'm on one of these little trolley style tour buses, where they stop every so. And so we're on a trolley tour of a relatively small island, and I look out, and sure enough, there's a white minivan, and I see this guy unloading something heavy, and I'll be darned if it isn't Dan Harrison, 600 miles away from home. Neither one of us had a clue the other one was going to be there. I love the small world. When it comes to this, Daniel is a senior professor of sociology at Lander University, and he wrote a book that I have read and that I had him autograph for me because I'm like that. Um, I was not surprised to discover he was an exceptional writer, but I was very happy to have that confirmed. The story he's going to share with us is the kind of story that you wouldn't, and it sounds kind of obvious, but this is the kind of story that if you haven't heard it, you never would have. And it's a story worth telling. I want to say he worked on it for more than 2 years, including a portion of a sabbatical. Dan is about to tell us a story worth telling, and he's almost like an academic necromancer. He brought a story back to life that shouldn't be able to be told anymore. And it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce to you my friend and respected colleague, Dr. Dan Harrison. And I guess we go like this to pretend we're clapping because we're online. And then Dan, if you want to unmute, I will
Yeah.
mute myself.
Well, thank you, Matt. That's absolutely amazing. I really had no idea that I was the first person to be nice to you when you were visiting Lander. But no, as Matt said, his office is about three doors down from mine. And despite the fact that he's in a different college and everything, we have a lot of fun up on the mezzanine and are in a football pool together and so on and so forth. So I'm so glad you decided to stay with us, Matt, because Matt, you were promoted just a couple of years ago, I believe, as well. So I do have some slides that I'm going to share in a second. I just kind of want to provide a little overview of what we'll be talking about today, and which is my book, Live at Jackson Station. And that came out. I guess I'll just go ahead and start sharing. And that book came out in January of 2021. And let me just get the slideshow going here. And here is the cover of the book. And you can get it in a paperback. You can also get it in a hardback if you would like to. And it's also available as an audio book. And I actually see Shirley Hirsch here from Simpsonville, South Carolina, who has the audio book cover up on her screen. And that one is a little bit more gory than the original cover for reasons that will be apparent a little bit later on. So this book I started researching in May of 2024, so almost 11 years ago. And I worked on it for, how long did I work on it for? I worked on it for a few years on and off, and then I got a grant to assist these engineers at Clemson University, actually on a sea level rise project. And so for a couple of years, my attention kind of got diverted, and this was on the back burner. And then in 2018, I was on a sabbatical, and that's actually sort of when I put the first draft of the whole thing together. I first learned about Jackson Station a few years after I moved to Greenwood. And my wife and I are really big music fans. And we are, in particular, fans of a band called Widespread Panic. I'm not sure if anyone here knows that band, Widespread Panic, but they're considered to be a quote unquote jam band. And so a jam band is sort of a style of rock music where the songs can sometimes go on for like 7, 8, or 10 minutes, because just with extended guitar solos and lots of drumming and so on and so forth. And Widespread Panic, they're still around actually. I'm going to see them at Red Rocks this summer in Colorado, funnily enough. Although they're like pushing 70. But they're still a really, really good band. And my wife and I had seen them in Colorado at Red Rocks before I moved to South Carolina, and also at Telluride. And some friends of ours in Greenwood mentioned, oh yeah, Widespread Panic, played in Greenwood back in the day. And I found that to be, sort of astounding, because usually this band plays very large musical venues, like Red Rocks, like the, Alpharetta Amphitheater, like Madison Square Gardens, and so on and so forth. And so I was scratching my head to think, just where would they have played in Greenwood, right? Because it's such a small town. And I said, well, was it at Lander? No, it wasn't at Lander. Was it at at the Civic Center? No, it wasn't at the Civic Center. It was at a place up in Hodges. And I said, well, Hodges, well, that's kind of even stranger still, because Hodges is such a tiny little town and there's really nothing there. And I couldn't think of any, arena-sized, venues or convention centers and so on and so forth. But they said no. They played at this little railroad depot, this old place called Jackson Station up in Hodges. And I said, well, where's that exactly? And they said, oh, it's right next to Harvley's Waterhole. So if you know anything about Greenwood, if you go north of Greenwood on 25, about 9 miles north of town, you come to an intersection there, a crossroads, and you will see this actual structure there, which is the old railroad depot, the old Hodges Railroad Depot, which until Gerald Jackson, who is kind of the protagonist of the story, moved it out of the center of town. This was one of two railroad depots actually in Hodges, and this was the original Greenville and Columbia depot. So it was on that line. And so anyway, once I learned that the Widespread Panic had played at this club, it really kind of piqued my interest. And I decided to sort of dig a little deeper. And so I asked people, well, what do you actually know about this place? And people said, well, it was owned by this guy named Gerald Jackson, and he was gay, and he had a longtime boyfriend, Steve, and Gerald was viciously attacked one day. They told me, by a maniac in the parking lot. And so that sort of added an element of sort of intrigue, I suppose, to the story, and piqued my interest further. And as a sociologist, I'm interested in issues of culture and community, and inclusion, exclusion, social rituals, all of these types of things. And I thought that this might make kind of an interesting case study, i.e. a sociological kind of research project that would focus in on this music club, right, in Hodges. So anyway, I may be getting ahead of myself a little bit, and so before I do, I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page, and I just want to briefly kind of tell you, kind of the 5 W's and the 1 H, in other words, the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how, regarding this book, and then talk a little bit about sort of, the different narratives in the book, and then we'll go through some of these slides in a little bit more detail. So we'll start with the what. So the book really is about this place, Jackson Station, as I mentioned before, which was a functional railroad depot, which then was converted into a blues club, an R&B club by Gerald Jackson and his boyfriend, Steve Bryant, and Gerald's mother, Elizabeth Jackson. They moved it in 1975, and it opened up as a club in 1978, and it lasted under Gerald's sort of ownership until 1990. And then some other people tried to resurrect the club after the tragedy, but they didn't have too much success. Who is in the book? Well, Gerald Jackson, as I mentioned before, he is, the key protagonist. His mother, Elizabeth Jackson, another very important character in the book. Steve Bryant, Gerald's long-term boyfriend. They're kind of the three principal characters in the book. But there's a lot of Greenwood, which is in the book. And if you have the book, you can go to the index and you might actually see some people that you recognize if you've been in the area for a while. And it also features, the musicians who played at the club, the bands and the artists and so on and so forth, and so on. There really aren't too many books about the greater Greenwood area, I found. And so I think this is a pretty good introduction to Greenwood and Greenwood history and Greenwood culture. If you know someone who's just moved to the area and they're kind of unsure about what this place is, I would suggest that you give them a copy of the book or you tell them about the book, because I think it does provide a good introduction to the place. When did the events in this book take place? Well, some of it is historical and some parts of the book date back to 1852, which is when the rails first went through Greenwood, and this depot was this depot was actually constructed a little bit later in 1880, but the first trains went through Greenwood in 1852. Let's see. And then the how and the why, I think I'll get to a little bit later. And before I kind of move on with the slides, I just also want to tell you about kind of the 5 intertwined narratives in the book. And so I mentioned earlier that I think this book is a good introduction to the greater Greenwood area. So it really is kind of a book about local history, starting with this history of this railroad depot and the history of Greenwood, kind of the history of the culture of South Carolina, and so on. It's also biographical in orientation. Gerald Jackson is the protagonist, and I do tell his life story in this book, from him growing up in Hodges, South Carolina, and going to Hodges Elementary School, and then going to Northside Middle, and so on and so forth, going to Vietnam, and his role at the club, and then the attack, and his death later on as well. So it is very much a kind of a biographical study, as well as a historical study. It's also a sociological study. As I mentioned before, I am a sociologist by training, and we like to look at what sociologists and others refer to as third spaces in society. And so these are spaces which are not, work, they're not home, they're third spaces, they're, common spaces, they're social spaces, and communal spaces. And these spaces are very, very important to the vital functioning of society, right? These are places where people go to unwind, to talk, to meet up with friends and intimates, and so on and so forth. And sociology is well known for focus for doing kind of like ethnographic or kind of quasi ethnographic research on local institutions such as these music venues. So that's kind of the third narrative, is kind of like a sociological case study. And then the other narrative is kind of ethnomusicological. I'm sorry, did I say the right? Ethnomusicology, ethnomusicological, which is basically looking more specifically at the musical sort of aspect of Jackson Station, a deep dive into the bands and the acts and kind of the genres that played at Jackson Station, and also how this club was very, very important to kind of the network that practicing musicians would work on, and which would support them as they sort of traveled throughout the country, playing different musical gigs. Despite the fact that that Jackson Station and Hodges are in the middle of nowhere, it is kind of strategically located, you know, from a regional standpoint or a national standpoint. And so artists would come up, you know, from Florida, for example, and they would play a gig at Jackson Station and then go to Charlotte, you know, the next day, and then go up the East Coast, and then they could go the other direction and go from you know, from Hodges out to, you know, the Midwest, and so on and so forth. So the club was a very important node on this musical circuit that went up and down the Eastern Seaboard. And then the fifth narrative addresses the attack on Gerald, the vicious attack, and I'll get to that a little bit later on. But you know, Gerald was attacked by a patron with a bush axe, and the fellow put the bush axe 3.5 inches deep into his skull. He took off, went back to Greenwood, left Gerald, you know, bleeding out in the parking lot, and somehow Gerald survived that attack. And we'll get more into the attack a little bit later on. And he ended up forgiving the assailant, and so on and so forth. When I first heard about the attack and I knew about Gerald's sexual orientation, I assumed that it must have been some sort of a hate crime. And so, you know, when I started the book, I was sort of approaching some of the facts, you know, from that perspective. It turns out that it wasn't really explicitly a hate crime, but I think that Gerald's sexual orientation might have played a small role in sort of the vicious nature of that attack. And we can talk about that a little bit later on. So those are the 5 intertwined stories. And so, you know, you don't have to, I guess, enjoy or be interested in all of them to like the book, right? You could sort of dip into one of the narratives and sort of not pay as much of attention to the other one. For example, if you're interested in local history, but you don't care too much about you know, jam bands, for example. Okay, so I'm going to start going through these slides a little bit more rapid pace now. So this, as I said, was the original Hodges Depot. If you know where the Hodges One Stop is, which is where Godfrey's, it used to be known as Godfrey's, right in the middle of Hodges. This depot was right adjacent to that. Okay, and Gerald grew up just down the road from there. So this is an image of Gerald and his sister Ellen, and this is circa probably late 1940s, I would say. And behind him, you will see that it says Jackson. I'm not sure if I can read it out, but anyway, it says Jackson. I think Jackson General Store or Jackson Service Station. Anyway, Gerald's grandfather, Arnold Jackson, actually had a general store on the property where the depot is now located, you know, on 25, pretty much right at the corner of 175 and 25 north of Greenwood. And his grandfather, you know, had this general store and, you know, was a local businessman. Gerald's parents took that over. You know, when Gerald's grandfather passed away, and then tragically, Gerald's father actually died when Gerald was 12, I believe, 12 or 13. And this is a picture of Gerald around that age. And obviously, it's difficult to lose your father at any time, but especially, you know, when you're that young. And so Gerald, you know, grew up really fast. You know, after that, and he, you know, had to become sort of, you know, the man of the household, and he had an older sister, Ellen, and his mother to, you know, take care of as well. Although his mother, Elizabeth, she was very strong-minded, very, very independent, and she managed to run the general store by herself for a while, and but then it just became, you know, too much for her. So Gerald went to Hodges Elementary School. He went to Northside Middle School. He went to Greenwood High School, which at the time was, you know, downtown Greenwood, right across from the library. I think you may know the old historical high school there, which is now converted into apartments and so on. He graduated from there. I believe it was in 1968. And then he did attend Lander, I think, for a little bit. And there was another business college, I believe, in Greenwood, and he took some classes there. I'm not sure what classes he took at Lander. I haven't found any record of that. I'm not sure if the registrar has that information, but he joined the military in the late 1960s. In 1968, he joined the Navy and became a Navy corpsman. And so a Navy corpsman is basically a Navy medic, and they are embedded with Marines. And so Gerald went to Vietnam as a Navy corpsman, a medic, and he was with Marines as they were, fighting in Vietnam. And so he saw, a tremendous amount of death and injury and heartbreak and horror and so on and so forth. So after the war is over, he comes back to Greenwood, South Carolina, and doesn't really know what he wants to do with his life. For like a lot of veterans, it's really tough to make the transition back into mainstream society. And so he worked for a while at a special needs center in Clinton. I think it was called the Witten Center, I believe. Some of these details are a little fuzzy because it's been a while since I've read the book myself. But he worked over in Clinton, basically as kind of a counselor slash social worker for a couple of years. But his real dream was to open up a blues club. And so while he was over in Vietnam, and I think outside of Vietnam too, I'm not sure exactly where he went, but it's well known that there were places in Southeast Asia where the members of the military would go for rest and relaxation and things. If you've seen the movie Full Metal Jacket by Stanley Kubrick, there's one scene where they're kind of walking around and there's lots of kind of partying and music and sort of wild things going on, and the GIs are off, blowing off a lot of steam. And so what people would do is they would kind of set up these makeshift blues clubs. And Gerald thought that was pretty cool, and he figured that he could do something similar back in Hodges, where he was from, and he thought that it would be great. He could host the bands and everything, and he'd be providing a service to the community. And so that was his dream, was to open up this music venue. And he just needed a venue for it. He needed a location. And so what he did was he took this old railroad depot, and at the time, the railroad company was just going to get rid of it. As I said, this was right next to Godfrey's, the Hodges One Stop. And one day, Gerald was going through town, and he saw some railway men sort of, milling around the building. And he asked them what they were doing and what their intentions were. And he said, well, you can have it for $1 if you get rid of it within 6 months. And Gerald said, wow, that's absolutely amazing, right? And so, but he had to move it. And so he got with some of his friends, and he hired a fellow out of Anderson, and they constructed this 140-foot trailer, and they managed to actually lift up the entire building, which weighed, I think over 100,000 pounds, and managed to put it on this trailer. And they towed it all through Hodges out to the highway, which is where Gerald's family had this tract of land. And they had to take down a lot of utility poles, and some people in town got a little bit upset about that, and so on and so forth, because traffic had to come to a stop and so on. But it's all covered in the Index Journal. Hold on one second here, and and I mean, it's kind of a feat of engineering, actually, if you sort of think about it. I'm not sure how I would go about, moving a building as ancient and as massive as this one. So they moved it out to the old Jackson property, which is here. So this is an old Chrysler that Gerald and Steve had. That's Steve, Gerald's boyfriend. And then you can see the ramp to their right there, which was the entrance to Jackson Station. And then behind Steve, that's where Harvley's is, which is still to this day a little hole in the wall bar, and where you can get allegedly the coldest beers in Greenwood County. But it's only open a few hours a day because Otis Harvley, the owner, he must be like 92 years old, and he only comes in sort of, in the afternoons when he wants to. But that's a real institution as well. So they have the depot moved, and then they had to renovate it. They were living across the way at Mama Jackson's house, Elizabeth Jackson, and she sometimes she and Steve, sort of got into some conflicts. Gerald was a real mama's boy, and his mama loved him a lot, and Gerald loved his mama, and so on and so forth. But obviously there was a lot of affection between Gerald and Steve, and those triangular relationships, can be sort of difficult sometimes. But Gerald and Steve lived over at the family home for a while. Then they moved into the depot, and they lived downstairs in the basement in the summertime, and they lived upstairs in the loft in the wintertime. There was no air conditioning in this structure. But there were two big wood burning stoves, Barron stoves, which were from a company out of Atlanta. Okay, and so they worked on the depot. They fixed it up. It was very much a DIY project. Gerald taught himself, plumbing, electricity, all that kind of stuff. This was back in the day when you could really do that stuff, yourself, and you didn't have to worry so much about licensing and codes and everything else. So they managed to get it somewhat habitable, and then in 1978 they opened it up as like kind of it was a private club sort of initially. Like it wasn't open to the public. You had to know Gerald or know someone who knew Gerald in order to go there. It was almost like a redneck salon in a way, right? People would go up there and sort of live in a fantasy world as if they were in New York or LA or Chicago or something like that, right? And then a few years later, they started having musical acts there, and over time, the club became very well known for its amazing blues. And if you know anything about the blues, you might have heard of this fellow Nappy Brown, and he played at Jackson Station many times. He actually argues that his career was resurrected, because of Jackson Station. He was really popular in the 1950s and the 1960s, considerably less so. And when he started playing at Jackson Station again, his career, he became a lot more popular again. Drink Small, the blues doctor out of Columbia, he's still alive. I think he's in his mid 80s today. And then people like Fats Jackson and Sweet Betty from Atlanta. So this is a picture of Mama Jackson, Elizabeth Jackson, there with Gerald, and this is like circa 1986 or so. This is a very early picture. I mentioned Widespread Panic, the jam band, before, and so this is a picture of them actually on stage, which is really cool. And so the guy playing the guitar right there, his name is JB. He's the lead singer. And then the guy in the tie-dye, his name is Dave Schools. And they're actually, pretty famous, celebrity musical artists today. And they played at Jackson Station, I believe 9 times in the 1980s. They were from Athens, and when they first started playing gigs outside of Athens, Jackson Station was just, right in there, in their area. It was only 70 miles from Athens, and so they could easily go and play a few gigs at Jackson Station without having to, spend a lot of money. So pretty amazing crowds there as well. The hippies would come over from Athens and kind of take over all of Hodges and so on. Here's another image of Drink Small. And it really was kind of the focal point in the community. It was the only late night bar in town. I love this picture because you can just see all the wonderful, 80s haircuts and so on and so forth. The hours were kind of peculiar. It was 5 to 5, 6 days a week, and on Friday night, Saturday morning, it didn't close. And so some people would get there at 5 in the evening, and then they might, not leave until sunrise. And it it had its own kind of special culture, and it was very accepting to all types of people. And that was one very interesting thing, researching this book. I conducted, I think, 65 interviews with different people who were, associated with the place. I didn't talk to Steve, unfortunately, or Gerald, because they had both passed away. I couldn't speak to Elizabeth because she had passed away as well. But I did talk to a number of patrons and friends of Gerald and Steve, and musicians and others who went to the club. But the local bikers, love Jackson Station. The cowboys and rednecks and college students and criminals and politicians. I mean, you would find everybody at Jackson Station. It was the late night place to be. And if you were interested in socializing and hanging out, with your friends, you would say, "Hey, I'll meet you up at Jackson Station later on tonight." And a good time was to be had by all. Gerald was known as being a very charismatic, host, and he would and he would. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. My wife just came in to give me a sandwich, which I'll eat a little bit later on. But anyway, Gerald, a very, very nice guy. He
Dan,
sort of had, yes.
Dan, I'm going to chime in and give you a 5-minute. I want to have time for a few questions because we end at 1 o'clock.
Oh, okay. I'll speed up a bit. Yes.
So yeah, go through a few things and then there's a few questions people might have.
Right. So anyway, amazing club. This is Gerald and Steve hanging out with the patrons. They had to put this skeletal frame around the stove so people wouldn't bump into it and get hurt. And there's Gerald, all sorts of decor, pinball machines, pool tables, just a really amazing place to kind of go and hang out. They had their own newsletters and things, which was pretty cool. And anyway, it all came crashing down it was actually the early morning of Saturday, April 7th, when this band here was playing, and this was Muddy Waters' backup band. And this was the night that Gerald was viciously attacked by a maniac in the parking lot. And this was him about 7 months after that. And you can just see that he was a completely changed man. It's amazing that he lived. Basically what happened is that some patrons were trying to access the club. Gerald's mother was very, very strict about who could come into the club and who couldn't. And if she didn't like the look of you, or if she thought you were too intoxicated, she wouldn't let you in. On this particular occasion, there were two fellows, Craig Douglas and Terry Stogner, who tried to get into the club at about 2 o'clock 2:30 in the morning. She told them to go packing because one of them still had an outstanding debt with her, and he didn't have the money to pay it. They did not leave. They climbed around the back of the club. They climbed up over the deck and got into the club. And when Elizabeth Jackson saw them in the club, she mentioned that to Gerald, and Gerald, with his security, bouncer guy, escorted them to the parking lot. When they were going to the parking lot, they got into an argument, and Gerald mistakenly, foolishly, followed the guy out to the parking lot to his truck, and things kind of escalated there. And he was a surveyor, and he took out a bush axe and he put it 3.5 inches deep in Gerald's skull. He managed to survive this, as I mentioned before. He was in a coma and at Self Hospital for a number of years, and then he was transferred down to the Dorn Hospital in Colombia, where he spent the rest of his life. He died when did he die? 2010, I believe. And this is him in the Dorn Hospital. He really got into painting, which is pretty amazing. He got into art therapy, and that's Steve. Unfortunately, Steve, he came down with esophageal cancer, and so Steve was very, very gaunt in this picture, and just made it a couple of years longer than Gerald did. And so I'll just stop there, and we can have questions. I don't want to spoil everything that's in the book, but that's basically, an overview of it, and hopefully I managed to hit all the high points.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dan. There's a couple questions and just some more comments in general, I think, in the chat about, the music of the era and these little small pop-up clubs that were kind of icons of that era. And one of the questions that Millie had asked has anyone approached you about making it into a movie?
No, I would really love that, though, or if not a movie, then perhaps some sort of a serial, because I think it would make a really good serial. I could imagine, starting in, the 1940s with Gerald's birth and growing up in Hodges, and then, just going through kind of what it was like to grow up in a small town in the South in the 1950s and then 60s and the Vietnam era. And so it would be great if that would happen. If anyone knows any producers, movie producers or TV producers, please let me know.
Right.
But I would love to see that happening.
Does anyone have any other specific questions that they didn't type in that they wanted to ask about the book, or just in general about Dan's career in our community in Greenwood? There's a lot of history about the area in the book that is kind of fascinating.
And I feel like you should have a musical background when you're making your presentation, so that we can hear it while you're speaking about the book. It's really great.
Thank you. Yeah, there is actually a podcast which my friend Mike Palmer out of New York helped me with. It's called Inside Jackson Station, and so you can actually find that on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and we do actually show or share some clips of the musicians that played there, and some other tracks and things. Unfortunately, there's not too many recordings. I wish there were more musical recordings of Inside Jackson Station, but it was kind of an odd time, and now it's really easy, obviously, to do live recordings with your iPhones, and everyone has that in their pocket. When Jackson Station was in effect, you still had pretty bulky old recording systems, and so it wasn't very easy.
And I think too, some of that, when you think about like the acoustics in some of those old bars, it's like when you're there and it's loud and there's all the people around, but then if you actually recorded that, trying to get all the background noise out to get like a quality recording of it is definitely one of the challenges of it. Ken,
Definitely.
did you have a question?
Julia?
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to thank Dan for this presentation. For me, it's really terrific to see the historical perspective of a building, because I'm an architect. And I started my career in 1973, and I'm now appreciating historically how every building has a story. And I'm actually a prominent architect, but nobody knows me. So nice. But I've designed a lot of prominent buildings in South Florida, and I'm actually working on a memoir, and I'm trying to tell the story of the architectural history of South Florida from my perspective. And I really want to know, how long does it take to write a book?
Ah, well, it's one of those things where, first of all, you have to have a passion for it, right? You have to have, I think you have to feel like deep in your soul that this story has to be told, right? And it's really not for the faint of heart. But this book, I started researching it in 2014. It finally came out in 2021. And so, you know, I guess the technical answer would be it took about 7 years. It took about 6 years and 9 months. But there were a couple of years where I really wasn't really doing much with it. And, you know, Lander is as Matt knows, is a teaching heavy institution. And so it's hard for us to you know, find a lot of time to work on these you know, substantive, you know, projects. But you know, for me, I had 2 young daughters at the time, and I could just, you know, I would work when they would nap and things, and early in the morning, and on Fridays when I didn't have to teach, and then on, you know, spring break and so on and so forth. But I found that if you just do like one thing each day, right, then you can make forward progress. And it doesn't need to be a lot, but maybe it's just a paragraph, or maybe you're, you know, organizing some notes, or maybe you're looking at another text, or maybe you're just copy editing. But if you can just do one thing a day, then you'll be pushing the ball forward, so to speak.